For many people, I imagine, the defining sting of the infamously acrimonious split between Kojima and Konami a decade ago came in the form of the publisher affording Metal Gear Solid 3, one of gaming's greatest stories, the visual upgrade to end all visual upgrades, and limited it to a pachinko machine exclusive to a few Japanese arcades. And it's interesting because the fervour with which fans of the series rallied against the publisher for such a move, the anger with which they demanded that this upgrade be made available in actual Metal Gear video game form, might have you rather surprised that that now released remake, Metal Gear Solid Delta, has been met with quite so much division as it has. Indeed, Delta has emerged at one of the most intriguing times such a remake could release. That is to say, a lot can change in 10 years. Raw technical fidelity, for example, is no longer the ace in the hole it once might have been in the mid-2010s. Video game graphics have arguably reached such a point of diminishing returns in the time since even that patchy slot release, that discussion instead has shifted to the ways in which such fidelity could in fact erode some of an original title's artistic direction and visual identity. Personally, the new character designs have been a bit of a sticking point right up until release, with the trailers feeling like they perfectly split the difference between Nintendo hire this man and one of those AI-generated fan-cast monstrosities where characters just look slowly at the camera and somehow still generate millions of views. Further, adapting a game into a more standardized, modern action game mechanical framework might feel smoother in the moment, but at what point are you just simply playing a different game? And with this in mind, it's not difficult to see why so many view modern remakes as a sterile plastic sheen, hiding those rougher but perhaps more human edges. Preservation has also become a hot topic in recent years, as the stench of corporate oversight has, in some cases, seen the attempted erasure of prior titles, all to get players to pay for the new, shinier thing. More than ever, we are told that we own nothing, and the act of engaging with art can feel as trepidatious as it does ephemeral, where art is product to be consumed and then thrown away, whether by you or the corporation that served it up. Long story short, it's a cultural tempest into which Delta releases, with all of these expectations and questions rested firmly upon its shoulders. And the end result? It's fine. It really cannot be overstated the extent to which Delta is just Snake Eater, for both better and worse. I mean, almost immediately, you're presented with the ways in which such an upgrade can be additive, providing flavour to scenes you've experienced a million times before. In the over 2 decades since Snake Eater's release, for example, that Halo jump has never looked so good. What was once merely a skybox through a mask filter now looks real, tangible, and importantly, goddamn huge. I have beaten this game dozens of times now, and never before have I noticed the vastness of the chasm Snake narrowly avoids careening into. Any misgivings about remakes aside, even momentarily, it's hard not to get swept up in just how shiny everything looks. The mud glistens, the paint on Snake's face cracks and scratches, as if just one more cicatrix on his deeply wounded body. But were it not for Konami sending me code, I don't know that such shininess would have enticed me to take the plunge right away. Because look, on a purely mechanical level, once again, this really is just Metal Gear Solid 3. My own misgivings about Delta prior to its release went beyond the aforementioned character models. Like the idea that the controls and mechanics of Metal Gear Solid 3 would somehow be updated to meet Delta's shift towards the Phantom Pain's visuals seemed extremely odd to me. I've long gone on record talking about how each Metal Gear's controls are designed specifically for the game they appear in, and how shifting those mechanical styles between releases fundamentally alters the game you end up playing. Snake Eater's areas generally aren't large enough, they're too linear to make full use of the Phantom Pain's ridiculously dense moveset, I thought. We'll have another twin snakes situation on our hands, I thought. But then you actually play it, and you find that it really is a case of updated controls rather than mechanics or systems. Like, there's no Flash Gordon-esque sprint button here. This new method of play, so to speak, lining it up with more modern action titles, largely amounts to simply shifting the face buttons around and putting aiming on the shoulders. Outside of that, controlling Big Boss feels like, well, controlling Big Boss, because it turns out Metal Gear Solid 3 was always a wildly mechanically dense game, basically on par with the Phantom Pain to begin with. It's to the extent that when it comes to what little is actually new here, changing camo with the D-pad rather than having to venture into multiple sub-menus every single time, I found myself so acquainted with the way Snake Eater controls, it was so ingrained into my muscle memory, that I was still frequenting those menus anyway. I barely used those new features because the old way just felt right. And here's where we come on to, well, the rest of the experience. Not the game itself, the experience of engaging with everything around the game. Because, look, until the now delayed multiplayer mode comes out, there really isn't much else to say about the package itself. The reintroduction of Snake vs. Monkey might legitimately be the best part of it. But this all says more about the current state of the series than anything else, with multiple critics talking about how Delta is now the best way to experience the game, that this is arguably where fans curious about the decades-old franchise should start their journey, given that it's the cleanest, least frictional way into the very start of a notoriously inscrutable timeline. You know, just buy the new thing on Steam, get the Big Boss story, and when you do eventually get to Metal Gear Solid 1, the name Big Boss will actually make sense to you. I've seen people say that they'd love to see this approach applied not just to the older MSX games, but to Metal Gear Solid 1 and Sons of Liberty. And I don't know, I don't want to say that there's a wrong way to experience any series, but part of the joy of playing through the Solid games in release order as a kid was the trust I always felt the game put in me to imagine what all these names meant, why they were all discussed with such hushed reverence. And then, when Snake Eater released, we finally got the pieces of the puzzle we were looking for. It was wild, for example, to see this formerly enigmatic gunslinging cowboy who seems to be able to cross everyone and manipulate everything to his will suddenly be presented as this arrogant young whippersnapper, getting absolutely schooled by the man who would come to define the franchise. And I'm just not sure how that presentation would work were I to experience it the other way around. And as for Metal Gear Solid 1's supposed mechanical impenetrability, well, just because it's older doesn't mean it's somehow impossible to get a grasp on. It's actually a relatively simple game. As many people have stated before me, there's like 20 guards on the entire island. You could beat it in a couple of sittings. You could feasibly play the entire game with your eyes glued to the Soliton radar. If Snake Eater, with all of its systemic and mechanical depth, presented itself as a sort of pseudo-immersive sim, then 1, with its blocky, rub the right weapon on the right scenario design, rendered it closer to an adventure game, with perfectly suited mechanics to boot. And when that game was remade to play at least partially like a more typical stealth action title, you could simply bulldoze all those carefully constructed puzzles with the Trank pistol. Look, my point with all of this, and I've thought about it a lot, is that I don't think it's a snobbish or gatekeepy opinion to say that new players being turned away from experiencing those old games as they are might give them a lesser experience of the series overall. And sure, giving more people more options is good, I guess. I just don't think that should come down to the newest thing is always the best one. Like, it's also a fact that this game is almost 100 gigabytes in size. And for me, when it comes to figuring out what's easier, being absolutely brutal in finding any way I can to clear that space, as I had to in this instance, or just utilizing any of the other means available with which to play the game at a fraction of the disk space, personally, there's a pretty clear answer there. And while they are certainly not perfect in this regard, Konami has, at least recently, actually done a fairly decent job of making the older games available to more people. And as far as that notion of availability goes, it's also not a guarantee that Delta will always be the cleanest, least frictional way to experience this game. It's currently very easy to buy the game on Steam or PS5 or whatever, but who's to say that will always be the case? That platform dominance or structure won't shift at some point in the future, and suddenly setting up Delta won't come with its own baggage separate from the originals. And what then? Do we remake or remaster or re-release a remake of a remaster of a re-release? And with all of the more philosophical questions releases like this do bring up, I feel it's important to bring things back to something more concrete. MGS Delta is, to me, a long-time fan, an interesting curiosity, an ultra HD texture pack, one that ultimately I feel okay engaging with, and very little more than that, because I experienced the series with all of its rougher human edges the way I did. A series, I should say, that is all out there, easily accessible, and waiting for you to fall in love with yourself. Thanks so much for watching. I told myself my codec video would be my last Kojima post for a while, but playing Delta brought up some stuff, I guess. Now it's out of my system, it's time to get back to some really cool, weirder projects I have cooking. Subscribe to see them when they're finished. A massive thanks as well to my patrons, who you can see on screen and are all getting access to exclusive, fully produced videos that aren't available here. Your continued support on patreon.com/writingongames is what allows me to keep going with the work I do on this channel, and I seriously cannot express how grateful I am for that. You are all the best. Special thanks go to Ewan Patterson, David Butkus, Brendan Hess, Mason Miller, Alex O'Sullivan, Michael Tritt, Rickety Cricket, Cameron Sinistros, Charles J. Liu, Alistair Dunn, Vitautis Catharsis, Dolly Bowman, Jon Condor, Danis Zakauskas, Christopher Farity, Nicholas Villeneuve, Leah Chinello, Captain Knisprig, Bryce Snyder, Seapage Melt Limited, David Björk, Timothy Jones, Matthew Grover, Shardfire, Lynn Browning, Dallas Keane, Charlie Kimball, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.